A dog walks into a garage in a small town. Nothing unusual about that, except this dog stops right in the middle of the room, in front of a man he has never down, and he doesn't move. His owner shouts the command. Once, twice. The dog doesn't even blink, because this dog spent 2 years in a war zone. He has been trained to ignore everything: pain, noise, fear. He has never once disobeyed a direct order, until now, until this man. And somewhere across the room his owner turns, sees a photograph on the wall, and goes completely still. Because the man in that photograph, the one who died 6 years ago in a place she has spent every waking hour trying to forget, is this stranger's brother. The dog knew before either of them did. He always does. The alarm never went off. It didn't need to. Garrett Hale opened his eyes at 5:57 every morning, not because he'd set it that way, because his body had learned. 6 years of the same ceiling. 6 years of the same grey light coming through blinds that hung crooked on the left side. 6 years of knowing exactly what the room would look like before he opened his eyes, and finding it unchanged. He had no way of knowing that before noon, a dog would walk into his garage and refuse to move, and that everything after that would be different. But that was later. Right now there was just the ceiling, and the quiet, and the 3 minutes he gave himself before he had to become a functioning person again. He swung his legs off the bed. Feet hit the floor. Cold wood. Good. The cold helped. Something about the shock of it pulled him back into the room, back into his body, back into the shape of the day ahead. He stood, walked to the window. The backyard sat under early October light, grass too long. He'd been meaning to cut it since August. He looked at it the way he always did, noted it, moved on. Some mornings he still turned toward the right side of the bed before he remembered. This was one of those mornings. He didn't let himself stand there long. Bathroom, faucet, cold water on his face. He looked in the mirror once and looked away. 35 looked older when you measured it in things that broke and couldn't be fixed. He dressed in the dark, didn't need the light. Down the hall, Owen's door was still closed. Good. Let the kid sleep. Owen was 9. He slept hard the way only children could. The kind of sleep that came without conditions. Garrett used to sleep like that. Before Lena, before Tate, before the years stacked up and sleep became something you negotiated with instead of fell into. He went downstairs and started the coffee. Stood at the kitchen window while it ran, the backyard again. Still long, still waiting. On the refrigerator, held up by a wrench-shaped magnet his father had bought as a joke 30 years ago, was a photograph. 2 men, desert, squinting against sun so bright it nearly erased their faces. Arms around each other's shoulders. Both grinning like they didn't know yet what was coming. Garrett on the left, younger, Lena, Tate on the right, taller, broader. That easy confidence he wore the way other people wore jackets. Garrett didn't look at the photo every morning, just most of them. Owen came downstairs at 7:10 wearing 1 sock and a dinosaur shirt 2 sizes too small. He climbed onto the stool at the counter and looked at the cereal box like it owed him something. This was normal, Garrett poured. Owen added milk to exactly the bottom of the bowl. Not a drop more. Some battles weren't worth starting. When are we going to visit Uncle Tate? There it was, every week. Sometimes twice. Owen asked it the way he asked everything, matter of fact. Like it was a simple question with a simple answer, and he just needed someone to fill in the blank. Garrett kept his back turned, opened the refrigerator, stared at things he wasn't looking for. Soon, he said, maybe this weekend. Owen nodded, went back to his cereal. Satisfied for now, Garrett had been saying soon for 3 years. He poured his own coffee and stood at the window. The grass, the fence that needed 2 boards replaced. The old swing set he kept meaning to take down and couldn't quite bring himself to touch. Some things stayed because removing them felt like a decision that couldn't be undone. He understood that better than he wanted to. Hale's Auto and Brew sat on a corner lot where the older part of town ran out of ideas. His father had opened it in 1987, back when this block had factories, back when the word neighborhood meant something specific. Now the factories were storage units and coffee shops run by people who'd never changed a tire, but the garage was still there. Same sign, same bay doors. Same smell of oil and cold metal, and something faintly sweet underneath that Garrett had been breathing since he was 12 years old. He parked in the spot marked Ogre. Not because he needed the designation. Because his father had painted it, and he hadn't painted over it. He unlocked the bay doors. Morning air came in cold and clean. He stood in the opening for a minute just breathing it. The tools hung on the pegboard where he'd left them, organized in a system that made sense only to him and had never failed him. This was the thing about the garage. Problems came in with a cause. They left with a solution. The sequence was knowable. The outcome was achievable. He'd never found that sequence for other things. The coffee corner in the back had started as an accident. People waiting for their cars needed somewhere to sit. He'd bought a used commercial pot at an estate auction, added 4 mismatched chairs, put up a chalkboard that said 3 things: coffee, tea, water. Nothing fancy, nothing he'd planned, but people kept coming back. Not always for the cars. The help wanted sign on the front window had been there since September. He'd interviewed 3 people. 2 didn't show for their trial shifts. The third lasted 4 days before explaining that early mornings didn't suit her lifestyle. He'd stopped expecting anyone to answer it. The morning moved the way mornings do in a garage, steady. One thing, then the next. Brake job at 9, oil change at 10:30. Transmission noise coming in at noon that he already suspected would be expensive news. The first coffee regulars drifted in around 8. Phil, a contractor who always ordered black and drank it standing at the counter like someone with 12 places to be. 2 women from the insurance office down the block who sat by the window and talked about things Garrett didn't try to follow. And Frank Greer, who had been coming in 3 times a week for 2 years and never once talked about himself. Frank was a Marine. Garrett knew that the way you know things in a small town, not from Frank, just from the way he sat, the way he scanned a room when he entered, the way he nodded at Garrett with the slight compression of someone acknowledging shared territory without claiming it. Frank's son had died in a deployment. Garrett also knew that, not from Frank. The town had told him. Frank had never mentioned it. Not once. Not in 2 years. Garrett respected that more than he probably should. He was wiping his hands on a shop rag at 11:15 when the bell above the front door chimed. Not the bay entrance, the coffee side. He came through the connecting door already putting together the polite redirect he used for people looking for the quick lube place. 2 blocks down. He stopped. She was already sitting. Corner table. Back to the wall. Chair angled so she could see both the front door and the garage entrance at the same time. Garrett clocked that immediately. He'd seen that posture before, in Tate. During Leaves home. That habit of placing yourself in a room so nothing could approach from behind. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Dark canvas jacket. Hair pulled back in a way that was functional rather than styled. She wasn't on her phone. She was reading the room. Taking it apart quietly. Beside her chair, a German shepherd sat with a stillness that wasn't natural. Trained. The dog wore a vest with patches Garrett recognized from across the room. Junior's animal, do not pet. The vest showed wear at the edges. Not neglect. Use. Her left leg extended from under the table at an angle that took him a second to read. The prosthetic started below the knee, carbon fiber, blade-style foot resting flat on the floor. She didn't shift to cover it, didn't adjust, just let it be there. Garrett made himself move, his boots on concrete. She tracked him the whole way. So did the dog. Morning, he said. Coffee! She looked at the chalkboard. Back at him, black. Thank you, quiet voice, not shy. Economical. Like she measured words the way she measured everything else. Only what was needed. He filled a mug and carried it over. She wrapped both hands around it immediately, testing the warmth the way you do when warmth means more than temperature. Anything else? She shook her head, then didn't. Her eyes moved past him to the pegboard through the open garage door. Your sign out front, she said. The help wanted sign. Is it still current? Garrett looked at it like he'd forgotten it was there. Because he had, yeah, he said. Still current, I'm looking for work. If you still need someone, he looked at her. At the dog sitting like a statue beside her, at the way she held eye contact when she spoke. No fidgeting, no overselling. What kind of experience? Not in food service, no apology in it. But I follow instructions and I show up on time. He almost said something back. Then the front door opened, 3 men from the construction site 2 blocks east, regulars. They came in around 11:30 most days. They filled the room with overlapping voices and the particular energy of people who had been working since 6 and were ready for a break. Garrett held up a hand toward the woman. Hold on. He went behind the counter, poured 3 coffees, made change, wrote down Thursday for someone's truck. When they finally left 15 minutes later, he looked up. She had moved, not gone, just moved. 2 tables closer to the counter, same wall angle, same sight lines to both doors. The dog had repositioned with her. No leash pull, no visible command. Garrett picked up the coffee pot and walked over to top off her mug. She held it steady. Her knuckles showed white against the ceramic. "You didn't have to move," he said. "One of them looked at the table I was sitting at," she said. "I thought maybe it was a regular spot. Open seating. Nobody has a table." She absorbed this. Small nod. Her expression said she wasn't entirely convinced. He pulled out the chair across from her. "Mind if I sit a minute?" That caught her off guard. He watched it land. She glanced at the chair, at him, at the dog. The dog looked back at Garrett with steady amber eyes. "It's your place," she said. "That's not what I asked." A pause, longer than necessary, then a small nod. He sat. Up close, there was more to read. The faint scar along her jaw that disappeared into her hairline. The forearms that came from function rather than vanity, the calluses across her palms. Old ones, built from gripping things hard over a long time. "You didn't tell me your name," he said. "Sloan Merritt, Garrett Hale." "This is my place," I figured. Her eyes moved past him to the garage. The pegboard, the lift, the calendar on the wall. "How long have you had it?" "Took it over from my dad about 6 years ago." "What made it 6 years specifically?" He felt the familiar compression. That story he'd had to reduce so many times. "My wife died. My dad was ready to retire. We moved up the timeline. I'm sorry." 2 words. Flat and clean. No extra warmth plastered on top. He preferred it. "What brings you through here?" he said. "Just passing through. To where?" "Nowhere specific." He'd heard that before. It usually meant running from something rather than toward something. He'd said it himself once. 3 weeks after Lena's funeral, driving on the highway at 2 in the morning with Owen asleep in the back seat and no destination in mind, he let it go. "You served," he said. Not a question. Her jaw tightened. The dog's head came up. Ears forward. "What makes you think that?" "The dog. The way you placed your chair. The way you tracked those men when they walked in without anyone seeing you do it." A long pause. "I was in for a while," she said. "Medical. I got out a few years back." "What branch? Does it matter?" "Not really." Making conversation, she didn't offer more. He didn't push. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was the kind 2 people sit in when they're both deciding how much to say. The refrigerator in the corner cycled through its hum. Outside, a truck rumbled past. Sloan broke first. "The job," she said. "Is it just coffee service?" "Coffee, tables, register. 6 to 2 weekdays, 8 to noon Saturdays. 15 an hour? When would I start?" "Tomorrow. Today if you want." She looked at him like she was scanning for the catch. Like there had to be one. Like no one just said yes that simply. "You don't want references? Can you pour coffee without burning someone?" "Yes." "Can you show up on time?" "Yes." "Then the rest doesn't matter to me." Something moved across her face. Not quite relief, the very beginning of it. The moment before you let yourself believe something might actually be okay. "I can start today," she said. Red apron behind the counter. "Coffee station is self-explanatory. I'll walk you through the register when it slows down." She stood carefully. Weight transferred through the prosthetic with the precision of someone who'd been doing it long enough to stop thinking about it consciously, but not long enough to forget it entirely. The dog rose immediately. Stayed at her left side. Garrett stood too. He was walking her to the counter, showing her where the clean mugs were stored. When it happened, Rex had been perfect through all of it, through the conversation, through the table moving, through 2 strangers negotiating space. Perfect, the exact picture of a working animal doing exactly what it had been trained to do, and then, without command, without trigger, without any visible reason, Rex left Sloane's side, walked across the floor, stopped directly in front of Garrett and sat down. Not playful, not aggressive, sat and stared, with the locked intensity of a dog that had identified something requiring its complete attention, every part of him rigid and focused. Those amber eyes on Garrett's face like they were reading something written there, like the dog recognized something, like the dog knew Rex. Sloane's voice went sharp. "Heel." Rex didn't move. "Rex. Heel now." Nothing. Garrett went still. He'd been around working dogs before. Tate used to bring them home on leave sometimes. Let them decompress in a civilian house for a few days. Those dogs had been capable of warmth, and also of switching without warning. You didn't make sudden movements. You let them decide. Sloane came around the counter, reached for Rex's collar. The dog stayed locked on Garrett, but something in his focus had fractured. Not from Garrett, toward something past him. "He never does this." Her voice had changed, the careful distance cracking at the edges. "I don't understand what he..." She stopped mid-sentence. "Gone, Tate?" Garrett turned. The photograph hung in a simple black frame between the chalkboard and the pegboard. He'd put it there 3 years ago and stopped seeing it about a week after. The way anything permanent eventually becomes invisible. 2 men. Desert. Squinting against light so harsh it flattened everything behind them. Both grinning, arms around each other's shoulders. Garrett on the left, Tate on the right. Below the image, a small brass plate. Captain Tate Hale, U.S. Navy SEAL, 1984, 2019. When he turned back around, Sloane had gone white, not pale, white. The color leaving her face like something had pulled the plug. She'd backed 2 steps toward the counter. One hand pressed flat against it. Rex had broken from his locked position and was now pressed against her legs, training overridden completely by whatever distress he was reading off her. Her mouth opened, closed, opened, Tate Hale, barely above a whisper. Garrett felt something cold and slow move through his chest. The kind that arrives just before familiar things become strange. "That's my brother," he said. "Was my brother?" Sloane made a sound, not a word. The kind that comes from somewhere that's been shut for a very long time and hasn't learned yet how to open properly. She was staring at the photograph like it was showing her something that shouldn't be in this room. Like she'd walked through a door that wasn't supposed to exist. "When?" she said. "Just that, 2019, the fall." She closed her eyes. Rex pressed harder. Garrett moved around the counter slowly. "The way you approach something that might startle." "What's wrong?" She shook her head. Small, involuntary, her prosthetic shifted against the floor. Her hand on the counter was trembling. When she spoke again, it was barely sound. "I knew him." The cafe seemed to contract around those 2 words. Garrett heard them clearly. Understood each one separately. Could not make them add up to something that fit inside the reality he'd been living in for 6 years. This woman was 31 at most. Tate had been dead since 2019. His world had been other SEALs, people who existed in operations Garrett had only understood from the outside. And she was standing here, in his garage coffee corner, white-faced, with a dog that had just refused to move. She knew his brother. "How did you know him?" She shook her head again. "This one wasn't involuntary. This one was a decision. I need to leave." She turned toward the door. Rex moved with her, positioning between her and Garrett, guard mode. Something had shifted in the dog and it wasn't shifting back. Garrett didn't reach for her, didn't raise his voice. She was at the door, hand on the handle, knuckles white. "Wait." 1 word. Quiet. She stopped, didn't turn, just stood there. "If you knew Tate," he said, "I want to hear about it, please." Her shoulders rose on a breath deep enough to see from across the room. She still didn't turn. Her voice came out so quiet he had to work to catch it. "You don't want to hear it. Trust me. Try me." She did turn then, slowly. Like the movement cost something she wasn't sure she had. The color hadn't come back. "Tate was my commanding officer," she said. For 6 months, Garrett held that. The timeline fit. Tate had rotated multiple times. 6 months could have been any of them. When? Early 2019, his last deployment. The one he didn't come back from. Garrett felt his pulse change, the way it did whenever he got close to the edges of what had actually happened over there. The official report had been stripped bare. Enemy contact, casualties sustained, remains recovered. Words that described an event without explaining a single thing about it. "Were you there when he died?" Sloane's hand dropped from the door handle. She swayed. Just slightly, just enough. Rex was there before she could correct it. Yes. That single word carried weight Garrett hadn't been ready for. He wanted to ask everything. Every minute the report had erased. Every detail that had been reduced to bureaucratic language and filed somewhere he'd never have clearance to reach. But she looked like she was held together with something close to its limit. "Sit down," he said. "Please, I should go. You look like you're about to go down." She glanced at the tables, back at him, running calculations behind her eyes. Then she nodded once and moved to the nearest chair. She didn't sit immediately, stood beside it with one hand on the back, like she needed a moment before she could commit to staying. Garrett went behind the counter, poured a fresh mug, added sugar without asking. The way Tate used to take it on leave when he needed the extra push after too many days of not sleeping. He carried it over and set it in front of her. "Drink that. Then we talk if you want, or we don't. Either way." She lowered herself into the chair with the control of someone managing pain that wasn't only physical. Rex positioned himself between her and the front door, still in guard mode, still watching. She wrapped both hands around the mug, didn't drink. just held it. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street. The building settled around them in the way old buildings do. When she finally spoke, she wasn't looking at him. I was combat medical support, embedded with Tate's platoon for 6 months. I went on every mission. You don't stay at base when you're the only person who can stop someone from bleeding out in a ditch. The casualness of that last sentence carried more weight than she probably intended. He knew you well? Garrett said. Well enough. We ran several operations together before. She stopped. Started again. Before the last one. And Rex, where does he fit? Her hand moved to the dog's head automatically. Fingers working through his fur in the repeated motion of someone anchoring themselves. Rex wasn't his name then. He was K9 designation. He was paired with Tate for the last 2 months of the deployment. Garrett looked at the dog with different eyes. Rex looked back at him, of course. Same genetics, same bone structure. Whatever markers a working dog learns over months of close proximity, the dog had found all of them in the brother left behind, and refused to look away. If he was Tate's dog, Garrett said, why do you have him now? Rex couldn't bond with a new handler after Tate died. They tried 3 people over 8 months. He shut down with all of them. When I got my medical discharge, they offered him to me. I'd worked alongside them for 6 months. They figured it was the closest thing to continuity he was going to get. That was thoughtful. It was practical, she said. Flat. I was being discharged anyway. They had a dog who wouldn't work and a medic who needed something to manage her own head. 2 problems, 1 solution. She said it like a logistics report. Like she hadn't just described losing her leg and her CO and her entire world in the same operation, and being sent home with a dog because everything else was gone. You still need him, Garrett said. Every day, she looked at Rex. Then added, quieter. He keeps me level when things get loud inside my head. Garrett said nothing to that. Not because he didn't understand, because he understood too well. Owen had served the same function for him in the first years after Lena died. Not a therapy dog. Just a reason. Getting up to make breakfast because the boy needed breakfast. Driving to school because the boy needed school. Something external, pulling you forward when forward had no appeal. The front door opened. Frank Greer. Garrett stood, went behind the counter, poured his tea, exchanged 30 seconds of weather observation. Frank took his usual table and opened his newspaper. Garrett came back and sat across from Sloan. Why did Rex react like that, he said. When he first saw me, dogs carry scent memory longer than most people realize, she said. You share genetics with Tate. Probably similar baseline. Same soap, same whatever runs in families. Rex had recognized it. That's why he didn't move. He thought for a second that. She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Garrett looked at Rex. Thought about what that dog had seen. What he'd been present for. What he still carried in whatever way dogs carry things. He was with Tate at the end, Garrett said. Not a question, yes. He stayed till. She paused. He stayed. Did Tate suffer? The question came out before he could catch it. He saw her flinch. Brief. Real, he was unconscious, she said. I made sure of that. The words landed gently. But they carried the weight of a decision made under conditions Garrett could only approximate from the outside. She had been there. Close enough to do what a medic does when there's nothing left to do but make it easier. Thank you, he said. For being with him, she looked at the table. Don't thank me. Why not? She didn't answer immediately. Rex made a low sound. Her jaw worked. Because I'm part of the reason he didn't make it. The room went still. Garrett didn't move. Just let her keep going if she was going to. She was. I went down first. Her voice flattened into something controlled. The register of a person reporting rather than feeling. I was the critical casualty. The first evacuation had 3 seats. I was prioritized. Tate stayed behind with 2 others to wait for the second bird. How long did the second take? Longer than it should have. By the time it arrived, Tate had bled out trying to keep the other 2 alive. Garrett sat with that. The official report. Casualties sustained. Remains recovered. Nothing about triage. Nothing about a medic airlifted out while her CO stayed on the ground and bled for 40 minutes waiting for a helicopter that came too late. The other 2, he said. Did they survive? Then he succeeded. She looked at him sharply. He should still be here, she said. He had a brother, a nephew he kept pictures of. He should be. She stopped. I'm the one who made it, and I don't always understand why that is. Garrett reached across the table, slowly. Giving her time to pull back, she didn't. His hand covered hers where it gripped the mug. Whatever you're carrying, he said. Tate made his choice. He knew the math. He stayed because that's who he was. Not because of you. Not because of any single thing you did. She pulled her hand back, wrapped both arms around herself. You sound like you already forgave him for dying. I had 6 years to get there. A pause. You sound like you haven't forgiven yourself for living. She didn't answer that. The front door opened. 4 people in business casual, mid-conversation, heading for the counter. Garrett stood, looked at Sloane. Don't leave. He moved to take orders. Poured coffees, made change. The whole thing took less than 5 minutes. When he turned back around, the table was empty, the mug was still there, mostly full, a folded piece of paper held down by the sugar dispenser. He picked it up. The handwriting was neat, controlled, letters formed with the kind of precision that came from training or discipline, or both. I'm sorry, I'm not ready for this. Tell your son his uncle was a good man. Garrett read it twice. She knew about Owen. Tate must have talked about him. Shown pictures, told stories in whatever space existed between operations. His brother had carried his nephew with him across an ocean and into a war, and had told a woman Garrett had never met enough that she remembered the boy 6 years later. He folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket. He looked at Tate's photograph on the wall. Still there. Still squinting against that desert sun. Still grinning like the future was a manageable thing. Garrett went back to the garage, finished the brake job, changed 2 sets of spark plugs, diagnosed the transmission noise as something that would require parts he didn't have in stock and a conversation he wasn't looking forward to having. Each task had a beginning, a sequence, an end. He needed that right now. At 5:30, wiping his hands at the end of the day, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He opened it. This is Sloane. I'm sorry I left. I wasn't ready. But I think I need to be. Can we talk tomorrow? He looked at the message for a long time. Then he looked at the photograph. Then he typed back, yes. Come by whenever you're ready. The reply came in under a minute. Thank you. He set the phone down and stood in the quiet garage with the day's grease still on his knuckles and the folded note in his pocket and the photograph on the wall. 6 years of a story with a hole in the middle of it. And somewhere across town, the woman who'd been standing in that hole the whole time. He turned off the lights, locked the bay doors, went to pick up Owen. When Owen asked at dinner what kind of day it had been, Garrett said quiet, which was technically true, and entirely insufficient. After Owen went to bed, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with the note open in front of him. Tell your son his uncle was a good man, not hero, not legend, not the mythology of 6 years of carefully constructed remembering. A good man. He folded the note, put it next to Tate's photo on the refrigerator, turned off the kitchen light, set no alarm. He wouldn't need it. At 8:23 the next morning, he heard her car pull into the lot. He was checking fluid levels on a minivan when Rex's panting announced them in the doorway between the garage and the coffee corner. Garrett straightened up. Sloane stood in the threshold. Same canvas jacket, different jeans. Hair pulled tighter today, which showed the small scar above her left ear that yesterday's looser style had hidden. She was braced. He could see it in how she held her shoulders. Like she'd spent the night preparing for this, and still wasn't sure she could go through with it. He wiped his hands on the rag. Coffee's fresh, he said. Help yourself. She nodded once, moved to the counter. Rex at her left side. He watched her pour a mug, add sugar, precise measured, her hands steadier than yesterday. The red apron hung on its hook where he'd left it. She looked at it. Then she lifted it down and tied it around her waist. The morning rush started 20 minutes later, and Sloane Merritt went to work. She came back every morning. That was the first thing. Not once, not twice as a test, every single morning. 8:30 on the dot, canvas jacket, red apron. Rex at her left side like a second shadow. She'd tie the apron without ceremony, move to the coffee station, and begin the day like she'd been doing it for years instead of days. Garrett watched this from the garage doorway and said nothing, because what was there to say? She showed up. She worked. She didn't explain herself, and she didn't complain, and every morning when she came through that door, Rex would glance once at the photograph on the wall, just once, just for a second, and then settle under the counter like a dog who had finally located the one place in the world that made sense to him. Garrett understood that feeling more than he wanted to. The regulars adjusted to her faster than he expected. Phil the contractor had her figured out in 2 visits, stopped attempting conversation on the 3rd, just held up one finger when he walked in. She had the black coffee on the counter before he reached it. He'd nod, she'd nod back, transaction complete. No words required. Phil seemed to consider this an improvement over most human interaction, which said something about Phil. The two women from the insurance office took longer. They were chatty women who expected chattiness returned. Sloane gave them accuracy instead. Orders remembered from day one, refills timed before the cup was empty, tables wiped before they noticed they needed it. By the end of the first week, they'd stopped expecting conversation and started appreciating competence. On Friday afternoon, the taller one said to the other, loud enough to carry, "She's efficient." It came out as high praise. Frank Greer was different. Frank came in Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Same corner, same newspaper, same black tea with nothing added. On Sloane's fourth day, he sat down and didn't open the newspaper. Just watched her move around the room for a while. Not staring, just watching. The way a person watches something they're trying to read correctly before they say anything. Then he said, "What branch?" Sloane didn't look up from wiping a table. "Army, medical. My son was Army," Frank said. 82nd Airborne. She looked up then. Frank's face was steady. The particular steadiness of someone who has had years to build it. "When?" she said. 2007. A breath. "Just one, I'm sorry," Sloane said. Not soft, not performed, just said. Clean and real, and without any of the decoration people usually wrap around those words when they don't know what else to offer. Frank nodded once. Opened his newspaper. Garrett had been in the doorway. He leaned against the frame and thought, she knows exactly what those words cost. She knows because she's had to spend them herself, and Frank knows she knows. Which is why 2 sentences did what 2 hours of conversation couldn't touch. Some things only land correctly when the person saying them has paid the same price. The work settled into a shape. Garrett fixed cars. Sloane ran coffee. The days moved with the particular rhythm of a place that has found its function and is doing it without drama. Owen started appearing 3 afternoons a week. This was not the plan. This was entirely Owen's doing. The first time it happened, he'd simply walked in after the bus dropped him, spotted Sloane behind the counter, climbed onto the stool like he'd been assigned that seat, and opened his math book. Sloane looked at him. Then at Garrett. Then back at the math book. "You want something to drink?" "Hot chocolate, if you have it. Coffee, tea, water." Owen considered this with genuine deliberation. "Tea," he said, "but with a lot of sugar." She made it without comment. Set it down. Went back to work. Owen did his homework. Rex drifted over and lay under Owen's stool within 10 minutes. Owen reached down occasionally to scratch behind Rex's ear without breaking his pencil stroke. Nobody made a thing of it, which was exactly why it kept happening. On Thursday of the second week, Garrett came in from the garage at noon and found Owen attempting to teach Rex to shake hands. Or so he thought. "He already knows that one," Sloane said from behind the counter. Still not looking up, Owen looked at Rex. "Do you?" Rex raised his paw and set it carefully into Owen's palm with the solemn patience of a professional humoring someone beneath his pay grade. Owen looked at Sloane. "Why didn't you say? You didn't ask. What else does he know? More than most people." Owen looked at Rex with genuine new respect, which was saying something, because his opinion of Rex had already been extremely high. Garrett poured his own coffee and sat at the end of the counter. He watched Owen try to discover capabilities Rex already had and pretend not to. He watched Sloane wipe down the machine with her back to both of them. He noticed the small almost smile she was keeping off her face. Just barely keeping that almost smile. It happened maybe once a day. Always because of Owen. Always gone before it finished arriving. She didn't know he'd started counting them. He wasn't going to tell her. The pieces about the deployment came out in fragments, not in any deliberate way. Not as a conversation she'd decided to have. More like a container with a slow leak. Small things scattered across days. Rearranging what he thought he knew about what had happened over there. The first piece came on a Wednesday. A delivery driver came in loud. Big guy, good-natured, knocked into a chair by accident, and the crash was sharp and sudden in the quiet room. Sloane went still, not a flinch exactly. A stillness that was different from her regular stillness. Rex was up in under a second, pressing against her leg before the chair had finished scraping. The driver apologized. Sloane said it was fine, she meant it. But Garrett had seen. After the driver left, he came out of the garage unhurried. Didn't make anything of it. "You good?" "Yes." A pause. Loud, sudden sound sometimes. She stopped, restarted. "My nervous system didn't get the memo that the war is over. How long does it take?" For the memo to arrive, she thought about that for a moment. I'll let you know when it does. He went back to the garage, picked up the wrench he'd set down. Didn't say anything else about it, because there was nothing else to say. Because she hadn't asked for a response. She'd just told him a true thing, briefly, and that was its own kind of trust. The second piece came on a Friday. She'd been quiet all morning. Not her usual economical quiet, a heavier kind. By 11 the rush had thinned to just Frank and one other, and the room had gone still enough that the quiet was audible. Frank looked up from his paper. Bad morning or bad memory? Sloane set down the mug she'd been holding. What's the difference? Bad morning ends by noon, Frank said. Bad memory just rides along. She looked at him. Bad memory. Frank nodded and went back to his paper. Yeah, I know those. Later, when the afternoon had slowed and Owen was doing homework and Frank had gone, Sloane came to stand in the doorway between the cafe and the garage. She didn't step through, just stood in the frame like she was testing whether she wanted to be in the conversation she was about to start. He was careful with his people, she said. Garrett looked up from under the hood. Who? She glanced at the photograph on the wall, Tate. He knew everybody's name, who had kids at home, who was struggling, who'd just gotten news from somewhere. A pause. Some officers treat their unit like pieces on a board. Move them, spend them, account for the losses and adjust. Tate wasn't like that. He made it personal, which made it harder, Garrett said. When things went wrong, yes. Her voice was careful and even, which made it harder. He wiped his hands. Giving her room, he talked about you, Garrett said. You and Owen. Showed pictures, from what I understand. Something moved across her face. The look that comes just off before something heavier. Owen looked like him even as a baby, she said. Same eyes. That gray-green. She walked back into the cafe before he could say anything else. He let her go. He was learning the shape of how much she could hold at one time. 2 weeks became 3. Sloane moved from the motel on Route 9 to a small apartment 4 blocks from the garage. She mentioned it the way she mentioned most things about herself. Briefly. As information rather than announcement. The way she'd say it looks like rain. Factual. Take it or leave it. Garrett took it. Said nothing back except that the parking at the apartment complex was better than the motel lot. She seemed to consider this an adequate response. She started arriving 9 minutes before her shift instead of exactly on time. Garrett clocked this without comment. She started knowing not just orders but timing. Frank's tea ready when he was still 3 steps from the counter. Phil's coffee poured before he pushed the door all the way open. She watched people the way she'd been trained to watch a perimeter, and now she was applying that same attention to knowing that the woman from the insurance office liked her mug filled to exactly 2/3. One afternoon during a slow stretch he came out of the garage and found her at the corner table with a notebook. Columns of numbers. Customer counts mapped against the clock. Revenue patterns. Peak hours cross-referenced with walk-in traffic versus returning regulars. He looked at the notebook. That's the register data, he said. The system isn't locked. I noticed. I wasn't snooping, I know. She looked up. You're not angry. Why would I be angry that someone's paying attention to my business? Most people would call it overstepping. Most people wouldn't hand me a document showing exactly where I'm losing revenue on Saturday mornings. He pulled out the chair across from her. Walk me through it. She did. 6 tables when the space could fit 12. A commercial coffee machine running on residential components that topped out before the morning rush peaked. No clear sight line from the counter to the far tables, which meant one person couldn't manage the floor without constantly moving. A Saturday window between 8 and 10 where walk-in traffic exceeded capacity, and people left because there was nowhere to sit. You could double Saturday revenue, she said. More tables, better equipment. Fix the sight line so one person can cover everything from the counter. That costs money I don't have right now. It costs money you could have. She turned the notebook toward him. The numbers are here. He looked at them. She'd been running these calculations for how long? A week? 2? Running them quietly in her own time, because she'd seen a problem and her brain had gone straight to solving it. Why do you care about my business, he said. She was quiet for a moment, because this is the first place in 4 years that hasn't felt like something I was enduring until I could leave, she said it simply. No drama around it, no request for a response. Every job before this I was holding on until I could go. This one, she paused. I don't want to go. He looked at the notebook, then at her. Let me run the actual numbers, he said. See what's possible, she nodded. Something in her shoulders loosened slightly, not relief exactly. The dropping of an argument she'd been prepared to make and didn't need to. That evening, after Owen was asleep, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with the financial records spread out. The garage ran in the black but barely. Most months he cleared enough for the mortgage, utilities, Owen's expenses, and not much room beyond. There was no expansion budget. There was barely a maintenance budget. He sat with that for a while, then he thought about Tate. The military life insurance had gone into a trust for Owen years ago.
College fund?
Untouched since the lawyers had finished the paperwork. Owen was 9. College was the far side of a decade away. And if the garage expanded the way Sloane's numbers suggested it could, that was an investment Tate's money would be making in exactly the kind of place. Tate would have understood. He wasn't going to decide tonight, but he was going to think about it properly. He closed the folder and looked at the photograph on the refrigerator. "What do you think?" he said quietly, to the room, to whoever was listening. The refrigerator hummed. He took that as permission to keep thinking. He asked her to come to the cemetery on a Saturday in late October, not as a long deliberation, more as a thing that had been waiting to be said and finally found a moment. They were at the end of a Thursday shift, the cafe empty, Sloane untying her apron. He came through the garage door and said it plainly. "I'm taking Owen to visit Tate this weekend. I haven't been in a while." A pause. "Do you want to come?" Her hands stopped moving on the apron strings. She didn't answer immediately. "I don't think I belong there," she said. "You were with him when he died. That means something." She looked at the apron in her hands. "What time?" 9, Saturday. Oakwood Cemetery. North section. "I have a car. I know you have a car." She nodded once. Hung the apron on its hook. Picked up Rex's leash. "I'll be there," she said, and left. Garrett stood in the empty cafe and wondered if he'd just done something wise or something that would break things that were only just beginning to hold. He didn't know. He went anyway. Saturday morning came clear and cool, the particular sharpness of late October that made everything look like it had just been washed. Garrett got Owen into the button-up shirt that only came out for occasions requiring formality. Owen understood what the shirt meant without being told. He didn't argue about the collar. They stopped at the florist on the way. Owen chose white flowers with complete confidence which Garrett chose not to interrogate. The bouquet was simple. The right size for leaning against a stone. Oakwood sprawled across 15 acres of gently rolling ground. The veteran section occupied the newer part, where the headstones were all uniform granite in rows that went on longer than you wanted to count. Every marker a name, every name a hole left somewhere in the world. Sloane's car was already there when they pulled in, 3 spaces down. She stood beside it in dark jeans and a gray sweater, Rex at her left side. Her prosthetic more visible today below the hem of her pant leg, her hair down. He'd only seen it pulled back before. It changed her face slightly, made her look less prepared for something. Owen spotted Rex before anything else. "Dad." She brought Rex. "I see that. Can I go say hi?" "We'll walk over together." They approached. Sloane watched them come with her face in the careful neutral position Garrett had learned to read. But underneath it, something else. She was looking at Owen and trying not to look too directly at the same time. Like looking at him fully was something she needed to work up to. Owen stopped 3 feet away and addressed Sloane with the diplomatic gravity of someone who understood this was an occasion. "Can I pet Rex?" Sloane looked at Rex. Then at Owen. "Let him smell your hand first." Owen extended one hand slowly. White flowers held against his chest with the other. Rex leaned forward, sniffed, then licked Owen's fingers once, measured and deliberate, and sat back. Owen's face broke open completely. "He likes me, he does." Sloane's voice was different, softer at the edges. "You can pet him gentle." Owen set the flowers on the path and used both hands. Behind Rex's ears, down his back. Rex received this with patient dignity, tail moving in slow, considered beats. The tale of a professional who had assessed the situation and found it acceptable. Sloane was watching Owen and Rex with an expression Garrett hadn't seen on her before. He couldn't name it exactly, but it was real. It was entirely unguarded. He let her have it without comment. The path to Tate's grave curved uphill between rows of markers. Names and dates that compressed entire lives into carved stone. Garrett had read some of them the first time he came here. He'd stopped after that. There was a limit to how much you could carry for strangers. Tate's stone was simple, clean. A small American flag beside it, straightened by cemetery staff. U.S. Navy SEAL, 1984-2019, beloved brother and Uncle Owen walked ahead, knelt, placed the white flowers against the base of the stone with the concentration of someone performing a ritual they'd invented themselves but taken seriously. Garrett stood behind him. One hand on Owen's shoulder, Sloane had stopped several feet back, standing at a distance that wasn't accidental, like there was a line she was measuring before she crossed it. Rex had stopped with her, then Rex moved, without command, without hesitation. He walked past Owen, past Garrett, straight up to the headstone. He sniffed along its base carefully, then he lay down directly in front of it, head on his front paws, eyes open and steady, not grieving, keeping watch, like this was something he had been waiting to do. Garrett's throat went tight. Behind him, several feet back, Sloane made a sound, small, controlled, but there, the sound of something pressing against a seal that had been holding for a long time. Owen looked over his shoulder. A silent question. Garrett said quietly, "Some goodbyes take longer than others." Owen accepted this the way he accepted most things he didn't entirely understand. He settled beside Rex and began telling the headstone about his science project, his voice moving easily through the still morning air. Garrett moved back to stand beside Sloane. She hadn't crossed the invisible distance yet. Her arms were wrapped around herself. Not cold. The other kind of holding on. "First time," she said. "At any military cemetery since my discharge. How long have you been out?" 3 years, and first time seeing his name on stone, yes." A breath. It was always a casualty report before, or a designation in a briefing. She paused. "Stone is different. It gets easier," Garrett said. She looked at him. "Does it?" He thought about the easy answer. "About the thing people say because it's what the moment seems to require." He didn't. "No," he said. "It just gets different. The shape stays. The sharpness changes," she nodded, slowly. Like that confirmed something she'd suspected and was relieved to have confirmed rather than contradicted. Her arms dropped. She crossed the distance, moved around to the other side of the headstone from where Owen sat. Looked down at Tate's name. Her jaw was set, her eyes were dry. She'd come here prepared. She'd spent Saturday morning preparing. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, barely audible, "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I lived when you didn't." A pause. Then, "I'm sorry I ran from your brother instead of staying to answer his questions." Owen had stopped talking. He was watching Sloane with the careful attention of a child who understands that something important is happening without understanding the content. Garrett gave him a small shake of his head. "Stay quiet." Owen stayed quiet. Sloane lowered herself to her knees on the grass, her prosthetic extending to the side, hands pressing flat against the earth in front of the marker. "I made a promise when you died," she said, "that I'd live well enough for both of us." "Make it mean something," she laughed. A short, broken sound, the sound of something that had been compressed for too long finally finding air. "I spent 7 years failing at that, hiding, moving, calling it surviving when it was really just postponing." She stopped. "That's not what I promised. You're here," Garrett said. "That counts." She looked up at him across the grave. "Does it? Because from where I'm kneeling, being here just means I'm taking up space you're supposed to be in." She looked at Owen. He should have his actual uncle. Not a woman who watched his uncle die and couldn't stop it. Owen solved the problem the way only Owen could. He stood up, walked around the headstone, stood directly in front of Sloane where she knelt on the grass. He looked at her with the direct, unsoftened honesty that children have before the world teaches them to smooth their edges. "Uncle Tate died saving people," he said. "Dad told me that. So that means he decided saving people was more important than coming home." He paused, working through it. "He wouldn't want you to feel bad about being saved. That's not how that works." Sloane stared at him. "Both things can be true at the same time," Owen said. "You can be sad and also okay. Dad says that." The careful structure Sloane had built to get herself through this morning came apart, quickly, completely. She folded forward, and Owen put his hand on her shoulder the way he'd learned from watching Garrett. Patient, steady, not trying to fix it, just staying present inside it. Rex moved from in front of the headstone to press against Sloane's other side, warm and solid. Garrett knelt on the grass. He put one hand on Owen's back, let the other rest on Sloane's shoulder. She didn't pull away. Didn't try to stop it or redirect it or manage it from a distance. She just let it happen. The 4 of them on the grass in the October light, around Tate's stone. While the morning moved at its own pace around them, some things couldn't be fixed. but they could be witnessed, and sometimes that was the more important thing. Eventually the crying slowed. Sloane sat back, wiped her face with her sleeve. The embarrassment came after, the way it always does when something that has been locked up for a long time finally gets out and you see it in daylight. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to. Dad cries about Uncle Tate sometimes," Owen said. Matter of fact. Unkind to no one. It's completely normal. Sloane looked at Garrett. He shrugged. "He's not wrong," she almost laughed. The sound almost made it out. "Can I tell you something?" she said to Owen. "About your uncle." Owen sat down cross-legged on the grass. Rex put his head in Owen's lap. Owen scratched his ear without breaking eye contact with Sloane. "The night Tate died," she said, "one of his teammates came to see me in the hospital. His arm was broken. He had burns on his legs. He walked from his ward to mine to tell me something specific. Owen was listening with his whole body. The particular stillness of a child who has decided this information is important." He said Tate made a joke, right before the end. Asked his teammate whether his fantasy football team was going to survive without him there to manage the trades. Owen blinked. Garrett felt something pull at the corner of his mouth, because that was Tate, not as mythology, not as the carved name on a granite marker. Tate as he'd actually been, finding the absurd angle on impossible situations, keeping the spirits up when there was nothing reasonable left to keep them up with. Was he scared? Owen asked. If he was, he didn't show it. Sloane looked at the headstone. I think by then he knew what he'd done. He knew the others were going to make it. I think that was enough for him. Owen thought about this for a while, the way he thought about things that mattered. He sounds like someone who was good at deciding what was worth it, he said finally. Sloane looked at the boy. Yeah, she said. He really was. They stayed another 20 minutes. Owen filled the silence with ordinary things. School, the science project, a kid named Derek who kept getting the wrong answer and then arguing about it. And the ordinary things were exactly right. Like the normalcy of it was its own kind of tribute. Life going on out loud in front of the stone. Exactly the way Tate would have wanted it. The walk back to the parking lot was lighter than the walk in, not because the grief was gone, because it had been set down, briefly in the right place, with the right people, and that had changed the weight of carrying it forward. At the cars, Sloane paused. Do you have plans? The rest of today? Garrett looked at Owen. Garden center. Then lunch somewhere. Owen had been listening. He looked at Sloane. Can you come? The question sat in the air between all of them. Sloane's instinct to decline was visible. It crossed her face like weather, and then something behind it caught it and held it. A different decision, if you don't mind the company, she said. We don't mind. Garrett said. Owen was already walking toward Sloane's to inform Rex of the change in plans. The garden center was Owen's domain, and he ruled it with the energy of someone who had been given a mission and intended to complete it thoroughly. He pulled them through greenhouse after greenhouse with the cheerful certainty of someone who didn't know what most things were called, but considered this a minor obstacle. Sloane followed. She knew, it turned out, which plants were toxic to dogs. She mentioned this with calm regularity as Owen reached for things. Rex navigated the narrow paths between tables with the dignity of a dog who had been in genuinely difficult situations and declined to be dramatic about a greenhouse. They left with a flat of marigolds because Owen liked orange and Garrett liked plants that were difficult to kill. Also 3 tomato plants Garrett privately gave until the first frost. But Owen wanted them, and Owen was 9, and some lessons needed ground beneath them. Sloane paid for a small pot of lavender without announcing it. Just tucked it under her arm like she'd planned it the whole time. You garden? Garrett said. Walking to the car I used to. She looked at the pot. I'm trying to start again. He didn't push on that, but he filed it. Starting again. At small things, lavender. An apartment lease. A job with regular hours. These were not accidents. These were a person rebuilding something from the ground up, quietly, without asking anyone to watch. He understood that method of reconstruction better than most. Lunch was at a diner on the east side of town that allowed dogs on the patio. Owen ordered a burger that arrived larger than his head and ate approximately half before declaring himself finished. The remaining half disappeared under the table with Rex's quiet assistance. Sloane saw this happen and said nothing. Garrett also saw this happen and also said nothing. Rex had earned the burger by being Rex. Halfway through the meal, Owen set down his fries. How did you meet Uncle Tate? Sloane set her fork down, glanced at Garrett. He gave the smallest nod. Your call. However much you want. I was a medic, she said. A person who helps injured soldiers. I worked with your uncle's team. Did you save people? I tried to. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Owen was quiet for a moment. Working up to the real question, could you save Uncle Tate? A pause, long enough to matter. No, Sloane said. I wasn't able to. But he saved other people before he died. That was what he cared about. Owen chewed a French fry. Thinking, then you're kind of a hero too, he said. Because you tried when it was hard. Sloane blinked. I appreciate you saying that. I'm not just saying it, Owen, entirely earnest. Trying when it's hard is the whole point. That's what counts. Sloane looked at him for a moment that lasted slightly longer than normal. Your teacher is right, she said. I know, Owen said and went back to his fries. Garrett caught Sloane's eyes across the table. She looked away first, but not before he saw it. That unguarded thing, the one she didn't know she was showing, he didn't point it out, he just counted it. The week that followed moved quietly. Sloane worked, Garrett fixed cars. Owen came in after school, Rex lay under the stool. Frank drank his tea. The days had a shape now that they hadn't had 2 months before, and Garrett was aware of the shape the way you become aware of furniture that has been rearranged. Not always consciously, but your body knows the room differently. On a Tuesday, midway through the 3rd week of October, everything shifted slightly. Garrett was replacing a water pump in the back bay. Radio on low, the kind of work that needs attention but leaves the rest of the brain somewhere else, which was the problem. He heard Sloane on the phone around 10. She'd stepped into the supply room at the back of the cafe, probably thinking the distance and the garage noise would cover her. It almost did. He wasn't trying to listen. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, which is the only way you learn things that weren't meant for you. He heard. He stayed. He made the choice to stay, and then no, I've been told that. I understand it logically, a pause, and then he recorded a message. Before the second helicopter. For his family back home, her voice dropped. Not quieter, exactly, heavier. The recorder was lost in the rubble when the compound came down. They never got to hear it. Garrett went still, the wrench in his hand, the water pump half-mounted. Everything stopped. Tate had recorded a message for Garrett, for Owen. Words chosen in the last hour of his life, spoken into a recorder, meant to travel across an ocean and land in a kitchen in the middle of the country where his brother and his nephew were trying to figure out how to keep going. And it was gone. Not that Tate hadn't tried to reach them. Not that he'd left nothing behind. He had. He'd tried. And the war had taken that too. On top of everything else it had taken. Garrett stood in the garage with his hand on the water pump and felt something move through him that he hadn't expected. Not grief exactly. Something older than grief. The particular ache of knowing someone tried to reach you and you never got to receive it. He didn't go into the cafe. He didn't say anything to Sloane. Not that day. Not the day after. But something had shifted in the space between them. Not a wall. More like a room that had been sealed suddenly had light under the door. He would have to decide what to do with that. He was still deciding when Brady's Sinclair walked in. It was a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. The early rush had just thinned. Owen was at school. Frank was on his second cup. Sloane was arranging the pastry display she'd recently convinced Garrett to add. A local bakery supplying twice a week, which had immediately doubled their morning revenue, which she'd predicted and he'd tried not to be too visibly impressed by. The door opened, a man. Mid-30s, work clothes, the build of someone who'd been in uniform long enough for it to rewrite his posture permanently. He stood in the doorway and scanned the room before he stepped fully inside. The scan of someone who'd been doing it so long they didn't notice they were doing it. Sloane turned from the display and froze. Not the same freeze as the photograph. That one had been shock. This one was older, deeper. The kind of freeze that comes from bracing for something for years and then suddenly not having more time to brace. Brady, the word was flat and careful. The voice of someone holding something fragile. Brady Sinclair saw her, and some of the tension in his face came apart. Hey, Merritt. Rex was up from under the counter, not aggressive, watching Brady with the focused attention of a dog taking a full measure before deciding, "How did you find me?" Sloane said Frank. Brady moved into the room, stopped several feet from her, close enough to talk, far enough to give her the space to decide what happened next. "You're Frank. I've been looking for a while." Sloane's hand had found the edge of the counter behind her. Garrett came to the doorway between the garage and the cafe. He stayed there, I came to say thank you, she stared at him. If you hadn't been the priority evacuation, Brady said, then stopped, chose differently. If the first helicopter had taken anyone other than you, Tate would have stayed for all 4 of us. He would have tried to hold 4 people together instead of 2, and he couldn't have done it. A pause. Your evacuation is what created the window he needed. Without that window, none of us make it. Sloan hadn't moved. You don't blame me, she said. I did. Brady said it straight. For a while, anger was simpler. Anger meant I didn't have to sit with the actual thing. He looked at her steadily. The actual thing is that Tate made his choice with all the information he had, and his choice worked. 2 of us are standing here because it worked. Sloan's hand on the counter was shaking. Rex moved first, walked to Brady, sniffed his hand carefully, then sat beside him. An acknowledgement that broke something in Sloan. She crossed the distance between them. Brady pulled her into a hug the way people hug when it's been needed for years and the right moment kept not arriving. Her shoulders shook, his eyes closed. Rex sat between them and against them both. Garrett stood in the doorway and did not move. Because this was not his. This was between these 2 people and the weight they'd been carrying in separate directions since 2019. This was the reunion that should have happened 3 years ago, 2 years ago, last year. It was happening now because that was when it could, and his job was to not interrupt it. He went back to the garage, set the wrench down on the workbench, stood with both hands flat on the surface, through the wall, muffled, the sound of Sloan finally crying in a way that wasn't controlled. Not the careful grief of the cemetery. This was older and rawer and had been waiting longer, and underneath it, softer, the sound of a chair scraping, and then the coffee maker running. Because Frank Greer had quietly stood up, gone behind the counter, and started a fresh pot, without being asked, without comment. Because Frank understood what these moments needed. They needed to be held. And sometimes the most useful way to hold a moment was to put a pot of coffee on and let people know that when they were ready, something warm would be waiting. Garrett stood in the garage and thought about Frank, and thought about Tate, and thought about the message that had been spoken into a recorder and buried in rubble and never arrived. He thought about that for a long time. Brady stayed an hour. He told stories about Tate that neither Garrett nor Sloan had heard. Small ones. Specific ones. The kind that don't make it into memorial speeches but are the ones you actually miss. Tate's method for losing at poker while making everyone else feel like they'd earned it. The way he'd remembered the name of every person's dog back home and asked after them by name. The joke about the fantasy football trades that Sloan had already told Owen, which made Garrett smile the second time, too. After Brady left, after Frank had gone, after the afternoon had settled into its slower rhythm, Sloan came through the garage doorway. She stopped in the frame. Her eyes were dry now. She'd been crying for an hour and had none of it left. He drove 4 hours, she said. I know. To say thank you, I know. She leaned against the door frame. Looked at the photograph on the wall across the room. I've been carrying the wrong version of the story, she said. Garrett set down the socket wrench. How long have you known there might be a different version? Since about 20 minutes after I walked into your garage and saw that photograph. She paused. I just didn't know if I was allowed to believe it. He crossed the garage floor toward her, stopped a few feet away. You're allowed, he said. She looked at him, her face, for once entirely without the careful distance. Just her face, okay, she said. Quiet. Real Rex came to stand between them, tail moving. They both looked down at him, then at each other. Okay, Garrett said back. Owen came in from school 40 minutes later and found them both at the corner table with coffee, not quite talking about anything, but not quite not talking either. He looked at the situation, at Rex, who was entirely relaxed, at Sloan, whose eyes were a little red but whose posture had changed, at Garrett, who was doing the thing he did when he was trying not to show something. Owen climbed onto his stool, opened his homework. Good day or bad day, he said. Not to either of them specifically. Sloan and Garrett looked at each other. Both, Sloan said. Owen nodded without looking up from his math book. Those are the ones that matter, he said. And outside, the late October light came through the windows at a low angle, the kind that made everything it touched look like it was worth keeping. November came in without apology, the kind of cold that doesn't ease you into it, that shows up overnight and rearranges everything, makes the morning feel like a different country than the one you went to sleep in. Garrett noticed it the first morning he unlocked the bay doors, and the air came in sharp enough to sting. He stood in the opening for a moment the way he always did. But the ritual felt different now. Lighter in some way he hadn't earned yet and didn't want to examine too closely. The garage was the same. Same tools, same lift, same smell of cold metal and old oil that had lived in his clothes since he was old enough to hand his father wrenches. Same calendar on the wall with appointments in his handwriting. Same photograph of two men squinting against desert sun, but the coffee corner wasn't the same. It was louder, fuller. People arrived earlier and stayed longer. Frank had started bringing a friend on Thursdays, a retired postal worker named George, who drank decaf and had opinions about everything, which Frank seemed to find more entertaining than annoying. Brady Sinclair appeared on Tuesday mornings now, which had turned out to be because Brady and Frank had served during overlapping years and had apparently left a number of arguments unfinished for several decades. And Sloane was still there, every morning at 8:30. Red apron, Rex under the counter, orders memorized before people finished saying them. Still there, Garrett had stopped expecting her not to be. He couldn't pinpoint when exactly that happened. Somewhere between the cemetery and the afternoon, Brady walked in, and the careful accumulation of shared mornings. He just knew that when he unlocked the bay doors now, one part of him was listening for the sound of her car in the lot. And when he heard it, something in his chest settled into a position it hadn't found in 6 years. He didn't say that out loud. He didn't need to. Owen had already figured it out and would almost certainly announce it at the worst possible moment. Garrett was counting on it. The idea about expanding the cafe came back on a Thursday afternoon during the slow stretch between 11 and noon. Sloane had her notebook out again. New columns this time. More detailed than the first version. She wasn't presenting it, just working. But when Garrett came out for coffee and looked over her shoulder, the scope of what was on the page had grown considerably since September. More seating. A proper commercial espresso setup. A dedicated corner with a community board. Printed resources. Job listings, benefits guidance, housing contacts for people who needed them. You've been developing this for a while, he said. Since about 3 weeks after I started, he pulled out the chair across from her. She slid the notebook toward him without being asked. He read it properly. Not a skim, the actual numbers. Revenue projections against renovation costs. A realistic timeline that didn't pretend things were cheaper than they were. A breakdown of operating expenses for the expanded model. Where did you learn to build something like this? Medical logistics, she said. You plan resupply for a forward unit under operational constraints. You learn to build systems with limited resources and no margin for error. Same principles, lower stakes, slightly lower, slightly. He looked at the community board section, the resource corner, veterans specifically. There's nowhere in this town for them to go, she said. Not casually. Not without a 40-minute drive or a formal appointment that half of them will cancel because walking into a VA building feels like an admission they're not ready to make. She paused. Frank drives 40 minutes for things he could handle over coffee if someone in the room knew what they were talking about. Brady drove 4 hours because there was no closer place that felt safe enough. Garrett looked at the bottom line. She watched him look at it. That's not impossible, he said. No, it's not comfortable either. Comfortable and worthwhile aren't the same category. He sat with the numbers. The refrigerator hummed. Rex shifted under the counter. A car went past on the street and kept going. Tate had a military life insurance policy, Garrett said. I put it in a trust for Owen years ago. College fund. It's been sitting untouched. Sloane looked at him. I'm not suggesting. I know you're not. He looked at the numbers again. Owen is 9. College is 10 years away. If this works the way your projections say it works, the trust is whole again before he needs it. He paused. And if it doesn't work, we're in the same place we started. With better coffee equipment, right? He looked up. I'd be doing this with Tate's money, yes. For exactly the kind of people Tate spent his career protecting. She didn't say anything to that. I think he'd find the investment sound, Garrett said. Sloane looked at the notebook, then at the photograph on the wall, then back at him. Okay, she said, just that single word. But it landed with the weight of something that had been building for weeks. They shook on it across the corner table, her grip firm and dry. No hesitation in it. Rex's tail hit the floor once, a single thump, like punctuation. Construction started on a Monday at the end of November. Contractors arrived at 7 with equipment, and the cheerful, destructive energy of people who had been hired to make things worse before they made them better. The garage stayed operational throughout. The coffee side closed for 2 weeks, which Garrett had expected to be a problem and turned out to be less of one than anticipated. Because the regulars simply came to the garage side and stood around drinking from paper cups while watching the renovation with the absorbed interest of people who had nothing better to do and were enjoying this considerably. Frank brought George every day. George had opinions about the drywall. Nobody asked for George's opinions about the drywall. George offered them anyway. Sloane showed up every morning whether the cafe was open or not. She walked the construction zone with Rex, checking progress against the plans she'd drawn up, redirecting workers who were about to put something in the wrong location. She did this without raising her voice, with the tone of someone who had communicated in conditions considerably more urgent than a disagreement about framing and had learned that clarity worked better than volume. The contractors listened to her, every time. Garrett noticed this and made a mental note not to get on her wrong side about anything structural. Owen came by after school and was immediately, completely fascinated. He wanted to understand everything. The load-bearing walls, the electrical rough-in, the way the new partition created the resource corner Sloane had designed. He asked questions with the focus of a kid who had decided this was genuinely more interesting than anything happening at school. Sloane answered everyone, not simplified, not softened for a 9-year-old, actually answered. Explained why the sight line from the counter to the far wall mattered for a single person managing a full floor. Explained the difference between what the building code required and what was actually smart. Owen absorbed all of it with the particular attention of someone who was filing it away for later use. One afternoon, Garrett found the two of them sitting on the subfloor of what would become the expanded seating area. Owen had a pencil and a scrap of drywall. He was drawing what looked like a layout for the memorial wall, names, a silhouette of a soldier, a dog that was clearly Rex despite the proportions being somewhat ambitious. Sloane was looking at the drawings with her full attention. "Here," she said, pointing to a corner of Owen's sketch. "This is where Tate's photograph should go. Large enough to see when you walk in the door." Owen nodded, adjusted the sketch with the focused confidence of someone receiving useful feedback. Garrett stood in the garage doorway and watched the two of them on the dusty floor with the construction noise around them, and Rex napping on a pile of drop cloth in the corner. He stood there longer than he meant to, because some things, when you see them, you don't want to look away from too quickly. It was the second week of construction when he found her sitting on the floor, Thursday afternoon. Contractors done for the day. Owen at a friend's house. The building gone quiet in the way construction sites go quiet after hours, a deeper silence than usual, like the space is recovering. Sloane was against the newly framed wall in the future seating area, back against the studs, legs out in front of her. Rex had his head in her lap, and she was looking at nothing in particular with the face she wore when something internal was louder than what was in the room. He didn't ask what was wrong. He sat down beside her. Back against the same wall, far enough not to crowd, close enough to matter. Neither of them said anything for a while. 7 years today, she said. Not Tate's death, he knew that date. September. This was her own calendar. The date she had woken up in a hospital in another state and been told what she'd lost and what she was going home without. "What did you do last year?" he said. Drove to a parking lot. Sat there until it passed, a pause. "The year before that I drank until it passed. The year before that I don't entirely remember." He said nothing. "This year I'm sitting in a construction zone planning a business expansion." She glanced sideways at him. The ghost of something almost wry. "It's very strange. Better than a parking lot." Significantly, she was quiet for a moment. "I went to see Tate yesterday, took Rex and just sat with him for a while. Told him about the plans, about Owen teaching Rex new tricks, about..." She stopped. "About what?" "About the fact that I've stopped wanting to drive away," she said it simply. No drama attached, just a fact she was reporting. "When I came to this town I had 2 days in mind. Get some rest. Keep moving. I'd been doing that for 3 years. Town to town. Job to job. Calling it freedom when it was really just momentum." She looked at the framing around them, at the studs and the rough-in and the outline of what this room was going to become. "I don't know exactly when it changed, I do," Garrett said. She looked at him. Rex sat down in front of me, he said. And you stayed to find out why. She considered that. That's your answer. That's my answer. She leaned her head back against the wall, closed her eyes briefly. When they opened, the worst of what she'd been carrying since morning had redistributed itself somewhere she could manage. Her hand found his on the dusty floor. Not quite holding, fingers resting lightly on the back of his hand. Just resting, thank you, she said. For this. All of it, you built this, he said. We built this. She didn't argue, which, for Sloane Merritt, was approximately equivalent to a declaration. The cafe reopened on a Saturday in mid-December, 12 tables instead of 4, booth seating along the new west wall. A commercial espresso machine that had cost more than Garrett was going to say out loud to anyone, and made coffee that tasted like someone had made considered choices at every step of the process. The memorial wall occupied the northeast corner, Tate's photograph in the center, large enough to see from the front door. Owen's drawings had been transferred to proper prints by a local artist. Owen had recruited through a combination of genuine enthusiasm and the specific moral authority of a 10-year-old who explained exactly why the project mattered. The artist had charged them half her usual rate. The community board was fully stocked. Job listings, benefits contacts, housing resources, a hand-lettered sign Sloane had made herself. If you served, you belong here, Paige. A college student from the university 15 minutes north, had been hired for weekend shifts. She was efficient and warm in equal measure and slightly in awe of Sloane, which Garrett found quietly entertaining. The reopening crowd started before 8. By 9, every table was full. Frank arrived with 4 people Garrett didn't recognize. Former military, all of them. He could read it in the posture, the room scan before sitting, the particular way they occupied chairs. They took the large booth and didn't leave for 3 hours. On their way out, Frank stopped at the counter and said, "Same time next Saturday, not a question." Brady showed up mid-morning and stayed to help manage the overflow. He had a way with new faces. Warm without performance. Specific without pressure. He'd been through the same doors himself, and it came through in how he talked to people who were still figuring out whether they were allowed to be somewhere like this. Owen bussed tables with the seriousness of someone who had been given a real job and intended to prove it. He carried dishes with both hands, refilled water without being asked, talked to everyone who wanted to talk and left alone everyone who didn't. A social skill, Garrett reflected, that some people never acquire. By noon, they'd served more people than the old coffee corner had seen in a week. At 4, when the last customers filtered out and Paige locked the front door and sat down with the relief of a person who had just run considerably farther than expected, Sloane stood behind the counter and looked at the room, chairs slightly misaligned, cups waiting to be washed. Owen's drawings on the memorial wall catching the end of the afternoon light through the new windows. "We did it," she said. Not triumphant, not loud, just said. "The way you say something true." Garrett leaned against the counter. "Yeah," he said. "We did." She looked at him and smiled, a real one. Both sides, reaching her eyes, no edges on it, just her face doing the thing it had been working its way toward for 2 months. He'd been counting the almost smiles. He stopped counting. This one was the real thing. December moved quickly after that. The way it does when you have reasons for the days to matter. Hector Wells found them on a Tuesday 3 weeks before Christmas. He came in on a wheelchair. He navigated through the front door with the ease of someone who had been mapping routes through difficult terrain for years. Brady was already there. He stood up from the booth the moment Hector was inside. "Brother." Brady's voice had something in it that wasn't quite steady. "Where the hell have you been?" Hector looked at him, then at the room, at the memorial wall, at Tate's photograph in the center, then at Sloane behind the counter. "Hiding," he said. Just that word. But it carried everything. Brady crossed to him. The hug that followed was the kind that only happens when people have been carrying the same weight apart for too long. Hector returned it with both arms and his eyes closed. Sloane came around the counter. She stood in front of Hector's chair. They looked at each other for a moment with the particular recognition of two people who shared something they couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been there. "Merritt," he said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "I should have reached out. Years ago I was." "We were all doing what we could manage," she said. "You're here now." Hector's jaw worked. Rex walked over from under the counter, stood in front of Hector's chair, looked at him carefully, then at Sloane, then sit down. The deliberate weighted sit of a dog who remembered. He was with you, Hector said. Looking at Rex, voice low. The whole time, Sloane said. A pause. He looks good. He has good days and harder days, she said. Same as the rest of us, Hector laughed. Short and genuine, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected to laugh today. Frank quietly guided the other customers away from the large booth without making it obvious. Garrett managed the counter. Owen did homework in the corner with the focused unconcern of a kid who understood the adults sometimes needed space for important things, and the right move was to not be in the way. Garrett worked the counter and caught pieces of what came from the booth, not words exactly, just the register, the weight of it shifting, occasional laughter that started wrong and then became real. The sound three people make when they've been carrying the same thing from different distances and finally set it down in the same room. After a while, Rex stood up from beside Sloane and walked to the center of the booth, found the space between Brady and Hector and Sloane and lay down there, an anchor point. Warmth at the center, Hector looked at him. Then around at the room. Tate would think this whole situation is completely ridiculous, he said. Brady. Without question, Sloane. He'd also think it was exactly right. Brady nodded slowly. He'd make a joke first. Then he'd think it was exactly right. They sat with that. Outside, December light through the new windows, the memorial wall catching it, Tate's photograph in the center, still watching, still somehow present in the thing his absence had improbably helped build. Owen turned 10 on December 18th. He wanted his birthday at the cafe. He had specific requirements, a specific color of streamers, Rex in a position of prominence, Sloane helping plan it, which was not negotiable, and which he stated plainly when the subject came up. Sloane said yes without hesitating. She and Paige transformed one section of the cafe into something that met Owen's specifications with enough additional detail that he pronounced it better than what he'd imagined, which was high praise from someone who had imagined it thoroughly. Rex wore a bow tie. He tolerated the bow tie with the stoic acceptance of a professional who understood that some assignments were not about personal preference. Owen's friends descended at 2 in the afternoon, and the noise level reached a register Garrett hadn't experienced since the last school field trip he'd chaperoned. Sloane moved through it without flinching, without going still, without the careful distance she'd maintained in louder moments back in October. 3 months ago, a sudden crash in the cafe had made her freeze. Today she walked through 10 sugar-fueled 10-year-olds with cake and an argument about a card game and navigated all of it without losing a step. Garrett watched this from across the room and didn't say anything about it, because she hadn't asked him to notice. But he noticed anyway, small victories, the kind that don't announce themselves, the kind that matter most. Toward the end of the party, as friends started getting collected and the energy came down to a manageable frequency, Owen disappeared briefly into the back and returned with something behind his back. He stood in front of Sloane with the gravity of someone delivering something important, held it out, a card. Construction paper, folded, Owen's handwriting on the front. For Sloane, she took it carefully, opened it. Inside, a crayon drawing. Sloane on the left, Rex on the right. Owen's proportions were sincere if not precise. Big hands, slightly too large heads, the earnest imprecision of someone who drew the feeling rather than the image. But the details were right, the prosthetic. Rex's service vest, the red apron, below the drawing in Owen's careful block print. This is for you because you are part of the family now. Happy birthday to me and Merry Christmas to you. Sloane held the card right at once. Read it again. She looked up at Owen. Her eyes were bright in a way she wasn't trying to manage. Thank you, she said. I'm going to keep this forever. Owen nodded. Like that was the only acceptable answer and he'd known she'd give it. Good, he said, and went back to his friends. Sloane looked down at the drawing. He understands family better than most adults I know, she said quietly. He had a good teacher, Garrett said. Then lower, and Lena was exactly like that. She saw people clearly from the beginning. Sloane looked at him. How do you hold both things, she said. Lena and this, Owen and whatever this is becoming. How do you not feel like one is? Taking from the other, Garrett said. Yes. He thought about the ring in the wooden box. About the night he'd stood in his bedroom and said words to a photograph. About the image still on the refrigerator that would stay there, because removing it wasn't the right answer either. I used to think love worked like a budget, he said. A fixed amount. Spend it carefully. Protect the reserves. He paused. Owen showed me that wasn't right. You don't divide it. It grows to fit what needs to be held. She sat with that. Looked back at the drawing in her hands. I've never had a family, she said. Not sadly. Just factually. Not this kind. You're in one now, he said, whether you planned on it or not. She looked at him. And didn't look away, I know, she said. Christmas came the way it comes when you've stopped trying to get through it and started actually being in it. It was a Tuesday evening in the last week of December. Owen was asleep. The house was quiet in the way it went quiet after 9, when the day's noise finished and the building settled into itself. Garrett was at the kitchen table with the end-of-month numbers spread in front of him. The cafe's December revenue had cleared the projection by a margin that still surprised him when he looked at it directly. Sloane was across the table with grant application materials she'd been building with Frank and Brady over the past month. The framework for a more formal veteran support program. Not government-funded yet, mostly community. But the bones were solid and the documentation was real. The kitchen smelled like the soup Garrett had made for dinner. Dishes drying in the rack. Rex under the table with his chin on Garrett's foot. The lavender Sloane had bought at the garden center in October sitting in a small pot on the windowsill, green and thriving normal. Completely, improbably normal. Sloane looked up from her papers. Can I ask you something? Yeah. The ring. She looked at his left hand. Was it a decision you made, or something that just happened? A decision, he said, an overdue one. She was quiet for a moment. Did it cost you something? He looked at her directly. Yes, he said. And also no. It cost me the last thing I was holding on to from before. But holding it wasn't making me closer to Lena, it was just keeping me. He paused, looking for the right word. Fixed. In one position, and now? Now I'm not fixed, she nodded. Slowly. Like she understood the difference between moving and being adrift, and was glad he did too. Rex shifted under the table, resettled. Put his chin back on Garrett's foot like nothing had happened. 2 evenings later, Owen looked up from his homework. No preamble, no context. Just looked up, Dad, he said. Do you love Sloane? Sloane's pen stopped moving. Garrett looked at his son, then at Sloane, then back at his son. Owen waited, with the absolute patience of someone who had already determined the answer and was simply seeking confirmation of what he already knew. Owen, because you smile more when she's here, Owen said. Entirely factual. And you look at her the way you look at pictures of Mom sometimes, except different. And you don't wear your ring anymore. Sloane had become very focused on the papers directly in front of her. That's a complicated question, Garrett said. It's a yes or no question, Owen said. It's really, Dad. A pause. Yes, Garrett said. Owen nodded, satisfied, the way he nodded when a math problem came out correctly. Okay, he said. I like Sloane better than most people you've ever introduced me to anyway. He looked at Sloane briefly. No offense, none taken, Sloane said to her papers. Good. Owen closed his notebook. I'm going to bed. He stood up, tucked his chair in with the deliberateness of a child who has accomplished his evening's objective, and went upstairs. The kitchen was quiet. Garrett looked at the side of Sloane's face. The small scar above her ear. The color in her cheeks that hadn't been there 4 minutes ago. You could say something, he said. She looked up. I love you too, she said. Steady, direct. If that's what you're asking, then why? Because I don't know if I'm ready for what that means going forward. She set her pen down, looked at him fully. This, us, Owen. A family with that word attached to it. I'm still learning how to take up space without apologizing for it. I don't want to move faster than I've actually healed. He looked at her for a moment. Then we go at the pace you need, he said. No deadline, no pressure. Just together, she said. Yeah. She looked at him across the corner of the kitchen table, the grant papers between them. Rex under the table, the lavender on the windowsill. Then she leaned across the corner and kissed him, brief, real. The kind that's also a question and also an answer at the same time. From upstairs with extraordinary timing, Owen called down. I can hear the silence. You're doing something gross, aren't you? They broke apart, both of them laughing, actually laughing, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. Go to sleep, Owen, Garrett called back. I knew it, Owen called down, and then his door closed. Sloane pressed her hand over her mouth, shoulders shaking. Rex looked up at both of them with the dignified bafflement of a dog who had witnessed human behavior for years and had not yet found a framework that made it entirely sensible. We have an audience problem, Sloane said. We have a very satisfied audience problem, Garrett said. She looked at him, still smiling. Still the real kind, yes, she said. I suppose we do. 3 weeks into January, a letter arrived, Manila envelope, out-of-state return address. A woman's name Garrett didn't recognize in the upper left corner. He opened it at the kitchen table after Owen had left for school. Rex asleep in the corner. Inside the outer envelope, a smaller one, old, the paper yellowed at the edges. Water stained along one corner in a way that spoke of a long journey through difficult conditions. His name on the front, Tate's handwriting. Garrett sat with it for a long time without opening it. He'd seen that handwriting on birthday cards, on notes left in his truck when Tate was home on leave, on a grocery list they'd made together for a Thanksgiving 12 years ago that Garrett had kept in a kitchen drawer for reasons he'd never fully examined. He knew that handwriting. He sat with it. Then he picked up his phone. Can you come by the house after your shift? Sloane's reply came in 4 minutes. Yes. Everything okay? I think so. I'll explain when you get here. She arrived at 2:20. Rex went to Garrett first when she came in, which he'd been doing occasionally since the summer, a small reversal of his usual order, which Garrett had learned to read as the dog's version of checking in on someone. Sloane looked at the envelope on the kitchen table. She sat down slowly. I found it 3 days ago, she said, going through a storage box I'd been putting off for years. I was clearing things out to make room. A pause. The box came from the field hospital, things that got transferred with me and I never fully went through, after I got stateside. She looked at the envelope. It was inside a waterproof sleeve tucked behind a folder of medical records. I don't know how it got there. The transfers were chaotic. She met his eyes. I opened the outer sleeve and saw his writing and I stopped. I didn't open it. It was addressed to you. Garrett looked at her. You sat with it for 3 days. I needed to find the right moment. He looked back at the envelope, Tate's handwriting on the front, the particular slant of his capital letters. The way the H in Hale sat slightly higher than the other letters, a habit Garrett had teased him about in high school. He opened it, unfolded the single page inside, and read, Garrett, if you're reading this then I didn't make it back. Don't spend too long being sad about it. You were always better at grief than me, and I mean that in the worst way. You go deep and you stay long, and I need you to not do that this time. Keep the garage open. Dad built that place with his hands. Don't let it become just a building. Take care of Owen. That kid is going to surprise you in ways you can't predict. Give him room. And if you meet anyone from my unit, listen to them, really listen. They know things about me I never found the words for myself. They're carrying me forward in ways I couldn't do alone. I'm not afraid of what happened. I want you to know that. I made choices I'd make again. That's as good as it gets. Tell Owen his uncle loved him. Your brother. Tate. Garrett read it once, then again. The third time he couldn't finish. He set the page on the table and cried, not quietly, not the managed grief he'd been practicing for 6 years, the older kind. The kind that comes out when it's finally been given the right room and the right moment and the right person sitting across from you. His shoulders shook. His breath came wrong. 6 years of carefully maintained distance from the full weight of it, all of it moving through him at once. Sloane was beside him, not speaking, just there. Her hand on his back, steady and present, not trying to stop it or redirect it or manage it from a distance. Rex came from the corner and lay down across his feet. Garrett let it go. All of it. Every careful morning, every 3 minutes before 6. Every soon when Owen asked about Tate. Every time he'd looked at the photograph on the refrigerator and felt the thing he was feeling and put it back where he kept it. It came out, and when it finally slowed, when the breathing found its way back to normal and the room came back into focus, Sloane was still there. He straightened up, wiped his face with the back of his hand. He knew, Garrett said. Yes, he knew someone from his unit would find me eventually. That's why he wrote it that way. He believed things worked out, she said. Even when they didn't look like it from where he was standing, he used to say that. It made me crazy when he said it, she paused. I'm starting to understand what he meant. Garrett looked at the letter on the table, then he stood. Walked to the drawer beside the refrigerator, the small wooden box inside. He opened it, Lena's photograph, his ring. He placed the letter alongside them, careful with the old paper, closed the box, left it on the counter where he could see it. Then he looked at Sloane. She was watching him with the steady attention she gave things that mattered. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. He went to the same drawer, moved things until he found what he was looking for, the trident pin. His parents had sent it after the funeral in a small box with a note in his mother's handwriting. Tate would want you to have this. He'd put it in the drawer because leaving it out had felt like something he wasn't ready for. He'd moved it twice in 6 years. Never found the right place for it. He set it on the table between them. Sloane looked at it. "This is the most important thing I own," he said. "And I want Tate to witness this." She was very still. "I'm not doing this because of a letter," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to do this for 2 months and I kept not finding the right moment. So I'm deciding this is the moment." He didn't get down on one knee. This wasn't that kind of moment. This was a kitchen table, a Tuesday afternoon, a letter from a dead man, and 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely way possible. The ceremony was in the sincerity of it. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not for the job. Not for Owen, even though Owen will absolutely lose his mind in the best possible way. For this, for us, permanently." Sloane looked at the trident pin, at Garrett, at the kitchen around them, the wooden box on the counter, the photograph of Tate on the refrigerator, Owen's drawings held up by magnets, the lavender on the windowsill. 6 months of a life built piece by piece from things that had been broken. Her eyes filled. She didn't let them fall, but they were there. "Yes," she said. "Okay, yes." She reached across the table and picked up the trident pin, held it in her palm, looked at it for a long moment. The weight of it, what it had meant. What she was holding, he would have had thoughts about this, she said. Multiple thoughts, delivered with complete confidence at least twice, possibly 3 times. She laughed. Short and real and slightly undone, and that was it. That was the moment. 2 weeks later, she told him she was pregnant. She said it in the kitchen on a Friday morning. Owen at school, coffee on, Rex at the back door watching a bird that had landed on the fence. She set down her mug, looked at her hands, then looked at him. "I'm pregnant." Garrett looked at her. She had an explanation ready. He could see it in how she was sitting. A plan, options, the posture of someone who had already thought through every version of how this could go. He stood up, went to the counter, picked up the trident pin, which he'd put there after their conversation 3 weeks ago. Still trying to find the right place for it on his person, he set it in her hand. She looked at it, then at him. "I was going to carry this today," he said. "I've been meaning to since I asked you. I just kept not finding the moment." He paused. "I think Tate should be with us when I tell you this." He looked at her. "I want all of it. You, Owen, whoever this is going to be, the whole thing. That hasn't changed." She looked at the pin in her palm. "Garrett, I know it's fast on paper," he said. "I know what it looks like from the outside. But I also know that Tate wrote that letter and it sat in a box for 7 years waiting for the right moment to arrive. And I've been waiting for 6 years without knowing what I was waiting for." He met her eyes. "I don't think we're moving fast. I think we're right on time." Sloane looked at him for a long moment, then she closed her fingers around the pin. "Okay," she said, quiet and certain. "Okay." He crossed the kitchen and pulled her in. She pressed her face against his shoulder. Rex looked away from the bird on the fence, regarded the 2 humans in his kitchen, swished his tail once, turned back to the bird. Everything accounted for. All positions held. The wedding happened on a Saturday in early April. Chosen rather than elaborate. The cafe closed for the afternoon, which Frank called the correct decision, and Brady called the only decision. Hector drove 3 hours in a rented van, which Garrett only learned about when Hector pulled into the lot and lowered himself out with the unhurried confidence of a man who went where he decided to go. Frank officiated. He had become certified online specifically for this occasion and had told no one in advance. He simply arrived with documentation and the quiet confidence of someone who had completed a mission. Owen carried the rings. He had practiced the walk twice the night before, which Garrett had pretended not to notice. Rex wore a bow tie. He had not revised his opinion of bow ties, but had accepted that they recurred at significant occasions, and resistance was not worth the energy. Paige stood near the back. She was crying before the ceremony started and made no effort to stop. Brady and Hector sat in the front and managed to hold it together through approximately the first 30 seconds of Garrett's vows. Sloane wore a simple dress the color of early spring, no veil, her prosthetic visible below the hem, her hair down the way it had been at the cemetery in October, the way that made her look like herself rather than prepared for something. Garrett wore a dark shirt. Tate's trident pin on his chest. Frank said the words that were required and a few that weren't. including an observation that he had watched this whole thing develop from his corner table over several months and had thoughts about the timeline. This made everyone laugh in the middle of the serious part, which was exactly what was needed because the serious part was very serious and needed somewhere to breathe. Garrett looked at Sloane's face when he said his vows. You taught me that still being here isn't the same as being alive. You showed me the difference. Sloane looked back at him. You taught me I was allowed to take up space, she said. I didn't know that before you. Frank said the official part. Garrett kissed his wife while Owen cheered loud enough to be heard from the parking lot. Rex barked once. Sharp, clean, emphatic, like a professional rendering a formal verdict. The cafe filled with voices and coffee and the particular warmth of a room full of people who had all, in different ways, come through something difficult and ended up here. Frank told a story about Tate that he'd heard from Brady that made 3 people cry and 2 people laugh at the same time. Hector and Brady sat in the large booth and argued about something that had nothing to do with anything heavy, which was its own kind of tribute. Owen ate 2 pieces of cake and explained to anyone who would listen that he was going to be a big brother in the fall, which he considered the best personal news of the year. Garrett stood at some point near the memorial wall with Sloane's hand in his. Both of them looking at Tate's photograph. He would have had opinions, Sloane said. He would have cried first, Garrett said. Then had opinions. You think he would have cried? He absolutely would have cried. He was terrible at hiding it. He'd do this thing where he'd look at the ceiling and breathe through his nose like that was fooling anyone. Sloane looked at the photograph. I didn't know that about him, she said. He'd have hated that I told you. She smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, April light on the street. Spring arriving the way it arrives when you've been waiting for it properly. Not rushing it, not dreading what came before it, just letting it come. Inside, the sound of the people they'd built around themselves. Tate's trident pin on Garrett's chest, still catching the light. The fall came full. Sloane's pregnancy moved through its months with the ordinary astonishment of a thing you know is happening and still can't fully prepare for. The Veteran Center took shape around them. A part-time counselor started coming Wednesdays. Brady organized a job skills workshop. Hector managed the community board with the precision of someone who had found his function and intended to execute it well. Frank brought new people every week and introduced them with the quiet authority of a man who had been doing this his whole life, even when there wasn't a building for it. Owen grew 2 inches between April and September, and Garrett kept noticing it at odd moments, looking up from a transmission and realizing his son was nearly to his shoulder and had been heading there for months without announcing it. In late November, 3 weeks before the due date, Sloane woke Garrett at 2 in the morning. He was driving in 11 minutes. Owen sat in the back seat fully dressed, talking without stopping, running through names he'd been considering for weeks. Rex in the back with Owen, completely still, monitoring the situation. 8 hours later, Garrett held his daughter. She was small and decided, the specific fury of a person whose schedule had been disrupted before they were ready. He looked at her face there. That's what I didn't know I was waiting for. She had Lena's nose, and around her eyes that gray-green that had lived in Garrett's family going back as far as he knew. Tate's eyes, Claire, Sloane said. She was exhausted and luminous in the way only possible immediately after something enormous. Claire Tate Hale. Garrett looked at her. Perfect, he said. Owen held his sister for the first time with both arms locked and the solemn concentration of someone who had been handed the most important assignment of his life and was going to get it exactly right. He held her that way for 4 minutes without moving, which was the longest Owen had held still since approximately age 3. Rex lay beside Sloane's hospital bed, head on his paws, eyes open, new perimeter established, new person to account for. He took his responsibilities seriously, he always had. On a morning the following spring, the bell above the cafe door chimed at 8:47. A woman, young, late 20s, maybe 30, canvas jacket, eyes moving across the room in a pattern that read exits and occupants before it read anything else. She chose a table, sat, moved to a different one 2 minutes later. Her dog, a Belgian Malinois with a service vest, stayed close and watched her face. Sloane was working the counter with Claire in a carrier on her chest, the way she'd been doing since coming back from maternity leave 2 months ago. Claire mostly slept through the morning shift, which Sloane had decided to interpret as professional agreement. She looked up, looked at the woman, looked at the way she'd moved tables. At the dog watching her face, she lifted Claire out of the carrier, carried her to the garage doorway. "I've got this one," she said. Garrett took his daughter. Claire grabbed his collar and held, which she always did. He settled her against his chest and watched through the doorway. Sloane walked to the counter, poured a mug, carried it across the room, pulled out the chair across from the woman, sat down. "First time here," she said. The woman nodded. Her hands around the mug were not quite steady. "I heard this was." She stopped. Started again. "I heard it was somewhere safe." "It is," Sloane said. "You found the right place." Rex stood up from under the counter, walked to the woman's dog, stopped in front of it, sat down, patient and still, not imposing, just present. The way one working animal acknowledges another who has been through something. The Malinois looked at Rex, then at its person, then settled. Owen appeared in the garage doorway beside Garrett. Home from school 10 minutes ago, backpack still on. He looked at the scene in the cafe, the two women at the corner table, the two dogs he watched for a moment. "Is that what we do here?" he said. "For people like that?" Garrett looked at his son, 11 years old, nearly to his shoulder. Still wearing the dinosaur shirt, upgraded now to one that fit. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly what we do here." Owen nodded. Dropped his backpack inside the garage door. Went behind the counter and started making tea. Because he already knew the order. Because he'd been watching. Because some things don't need to be taught. They just need to be seen, enough times, by someone paying attention. Garrett stood in the doorway with Claire in his arms and watched Sloane lean forward across the corner table and say something he couldn't hear. Whatever it was, the woman's shoulders came down an inch. Just that. Just 1 inch. But that was how it started. The trident pin on Garrett's chest caught the morning light coming through the new windows, sent a small bright point across the wall. Just for a second, he looked at it. Thought about a man who had stood in a desert 6 years ago and decided that some things were worth more than coming home. Who had made that decision clearly and without hesitation and had been right. Who had left behind a brother and a nephew and a dog who couldn't forget him. Who had, without knowing it, set something in motion that had moved through years and distance and grief and ended up here. In a garage coffee corner in a small town, with 12 tables and a memorial wall, and a community board and a woman who had learned to take up space, and a boy who already understood what all of it was. For Owen came out from behind the counter, stood beside Garrett in the doorway. They both watched Sloane talking with the woman. "Dad," Owen said. "Yeah, do you think this is what Uncle Tate meant?" When he wrote that thing about carrying him forward, Garrett looked at his son, at the room beyond him, at Sloane's hand reaching across the corner table, at Rex sitting calm and steady beside a stranger's dog, at the photograph on the memorial wall, watching all of it from the corner where Owen had decided it belonged. "Yeah," Garrett said. "I think that's exactly what he meant." Claire made a small sound against his chest. Not unhappy, just announcing herself. He adjusted his hold. She grabbed his collar again and held on. The morning continued around them. Coffee cooling in cups, voices low and real. The sound of a place that had been built for exactly this purpose, by people who had needed it first and understood it from the inside out. Outside, spring light on the street. Inside, the work of being alive continuing.